The silent neighbor. I moved into my new apartment just a week ago. The building was old, the walls thin, and the floorboards creaked with every step, but the rent was cheap. It was a quiet, peaceful neighborhood, the kind where everyone kept to themselves, which suited me perfectly. I had noticed an elderly woman living in the unit next to mine. She rarely left her apartment, and when she did, it was always late at night. A hunched figure wrapped in a large coat. I would occasionally hear her shuffling down the hall, but it was always so quiet, so quick, like she was trying not to be noticed. I didn't think much of it. I was used to living alone and didn't really interact with my neighbors much. But one thing stood out. Every night, without fail, around midnight, I could hear the faintest sound of scratching. It was coming from the wall that separated my apartment from hers. At first, I thought it was just the old building settling, but the sound was too rhythmic. It wasn't the kind of noise a building would make. It almost sounded like someone, or something, was scraping their nails against the drywall. It went on for hours, every single night. I tried to ignore it, but one night, the noise grew louder. The scratching was so intense that it vibrated through the walls, rattling my furniture. I couldn't sleep. My curiosity got the best of me, and I found myself standing in front of the woman's door at 2 a.m., my hand trembling as I raised my fist to knock. No one answered. The door was unlocked, just slightly ajar. I pushed it open cautiously. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from a dim lamp in the far corner. The air inside was musty, like it hadn't been aired out in years. The floor was covered in old newspapers and dust. I stepped inside, my footsteps silent on the thick carpet. The scratching sound had stopped, but now there was a strange, unsettling quiet. I looked around, but there was no sign of the woman. The apartment was sparse, just a chair, a small table, and a half-open door leading into a bedroom. My eyes were drawn to that door. It was the faintest sound, like a soft whisper, that made me step forward. The whispering grew louder as I got closer, until it sounded like a voice calling out, pleading, "Help me." I pushed the door open. What I saw made my stomach churn. The woman was sitting in a chair, facing the wall. Her back was hunched, her hands curled into claws, scratching at the wallpaper. Her face twisted in concentration, her eyes wide and unblinking. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the wall, as though she could see something hidden beneath it. I stepped forward, trying to speak, but I couldn't make a sound. My body froze in place. There, behind her, on the floor, was a trail of something dark, something sticky, a stain, slowly spreading, from the center of the room all the way to the wall. And then I saw it. Something, or someone, trapped inside the wall. Its pale, twisted hand pressed against the wallpaper from the other side. I couldn't breathe. The woman, her mouth opening wide in a silent scream, turned her head slowly toward me. Her eyes, empty, hollow, locked with mine. She whispered, hoarsely, "You shouldn't have come here." In that instant, the scratching started again. But this time, it was louder, more frantic. The sound of claws dragging against drywall, getting closer, coming from everywhere. The walls seemed to shake, as though something was trying to break free. I bolted out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me, my heart pounding. I didn't stop running until I was safely in my own apartment, the door locked tight. The scratching didn't stop, though. It echoed through the walls. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I went to visit the building manager, telling him about the strange noises coming from the apartment next door. He looked at me with a confused expression. "There's no one living there, kid," he said. "The apartment's been vacant for years. The old woman who lived there, she passed away a long time ago. We just never got around to clearing it out." I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. The image of the woman's hollow eyes haunted me. I still hear the scratching sometimes, late at night. It's faint, but it's there. And now, when I walk past her old apartment, I swear I can hear a voice, soft and distant, calling my name from inside the wall. Story 2. The Little Girl's Question. A few years ago, I was putting my friend's little girl to bed. She was about 3 years old at the time, and no matter how much I tried, she just wouldn't settle down. She kept asking me questions, one after another. Why do I have to go to sleep? She asked, her little face scrunched up in confusion. I smiled and tried to be patient. Because it's late, and all the good little kids need their sleep. She didn't look convinced. She sat up in bed, her eyes wide and searching the room, and then, without warning, she pointed to the far corner. What about him? She asked, her tiny finger trembling slightly as it pointed toward the shadowed area of the room. I froze. I turned to look at the corner she was pointing at, but it was empty. Just the usual shadows cast by the moonlight filtering through the blinds. There was nothing there. Sweetie, there's no one there, I said, trying to sound calm, though a small knot of unease was beginning to form in my stomach. But she didn't seem to hear me. Her gaze was fixed, unwavering, on that dark corner. He's been there all night. I think he wants me to play, she said softly, her voice full of a quiet, innocent certainty that sent a chill down my spine. I quickly turned on the lamp beside her bed, flooding the room with warm light. I checked the corner again, and this time I could see there was absolutely nothing there. No figure, no shape, not even a shadow that didn't belong. Just the regular dim corners of the room. I tried to smile reassuringly. See? Nothing there, honey. Time for bed. But she wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were still locked on the empty corner, her small body now huddling under the covers. He's there, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't want him to take me. I bent down to kiss her goodnight, doing my best to ignore the cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. As I stood up and walked toward the door, she called out to me one last time. Don't leave, she said, her voice trembling. He's right behind you. I froze again, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I didn't dare turn around, but I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Without thinking, I hurried out of the room, quickly closing the door behind me. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I couldn't shake the image of her pointing at the empty corner and the feeling that someone, had been watching us. The next morning, everything seemed normal, but I couldn't get rid of that lingering unease. I never mentioned it to my friend. After all, it was just a child's imagination, right? But I've never forgotten the way she looked at that corner. And sometimes, when I'm alone in a room late at night, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, just to make sure nothing is waiting in the dark. Story 3. The Mystery in the Yearbook. 2 years ago, I was sitting with my 5-year-old nephew, going through my old yearbook. He was curious, flipping through the pages, pointing at pictures of me from different school years. When we got to the page from when I was in 2nd grade, he suddenly stopped. His small finger was pointing at one particular photo of me with my classmates. He stared at it for a moment, and then he looked up at me with wide eyes. This person looks just like Nicolas, he said, his voice full of wonder. I raised an eyebrow. Nicolas? Who's Nicolas? Without missing a beat, he replied, he's the friend who hides in my closet. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to hide my shock, forcing a smile and asking him, what do you mean? Nicolas hides in your closet? He shrugged casually, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. He just hides there. Sometimes he watches me play, but he never talks to me. My mind raced. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I glanced at the photo again. It was a picture of me as a child, surrounded by classmates, laughing and carefree. But there was something unsettling about the way my nephew had identified me as Nicolas. The name wasn't one I recognized, and yet there was a strange familiarity in the way he spoke about this friend. I tried to stay calm, but the room suddenly felt too small, too quiet. Does Nicolas ever come out of the closet? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He shook his head, his expression unreadable. No, he stays in there. But sometimes I hear him whispering my name. I laughed nervously, brushing it off. Well, maybe Nicolas is just your imagination, buddy. Kids sometimes have pretend friends, right? But my nephew didn't seem to care. He just nodded, and then he went back to flipping through the yearbook, as if nothing had happened. He kept talking about his friend, like it was a normal part of his day. I, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about what he had said. Later that night, when I went to check on him before heading to bed, I noticed the closet door in his room was slightly ajar. The thought made my stomach turn. I couldn't help but wonder if there really was something or someone hiding in there. I quietly closed the door, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. But even now, whenever I think about that night, I still wonder, who exactly was Nicolas, and why did he look so much like me? Story 4. The Girl with the Long Hair. It was a late afternoon, and I was about to take a shower in my aunt's house. The bathroom was on the second floor, and as I made my way up the stairs, I saw my 4-year-old niece, April, sitting on one of the steps. She was being her usual mischievous self, making faces and laughing as if she were playing some kind of game. I paused for a moment and asked, "What are you doing, April?" She looked up at me, her face beaming with excitement. "I'm copying the lady with the long braid," she replied. I glanced around the house. It was just the two of us home at the moment. "What lady?" I asked, confused. April pointed toward the empty space under the staircase. "She's right there, Auntie." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I smiled, trying to stay calm. "What's she doing, April?" "She's making funny faces," April answered, giggling. I couldn't help but chuckle at her imagination. But then, as I was about to turn and head upstairs, April's voice stopped me. "Her braid is wrapped around her neck," she said, still sitting there, seemingly absorbed in her own little world. I turned back to look at her, feeling a sudden unease creeping over me. "What did you say, sweetie? Her braid is what?" April's eyes were wide. Her little fingers still pointed at the empty space beneath the stairs. "Her braid's wrapped around her neck," she repeated, matter-of-factly. "She's hanging by it. Her neck is making funny faces." My blood ran cold as I stared at her. "What do you mean by funny faces?" I asked, now barely able to keep my voice steady. April smiled innocently and tilted her head, then started to mimic a distorted expression, one that looked like she was struggling to breathe. Her eyes widened, her mouth open in a silent gasp. It was then that I realized. She was copying someone trying to suck in air desperately. I stood frozen for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one else in the house, no one except for me and April. And yet, she was describing someone who shouldn't be there. I forced myself to swallow the lump in my throat and gently said, "April, don't play around like that. There's no one here." But as I turned to walk up the stairs again, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was still under that staircase. The thought clung to me like a shadow, making the air in the house feel thick and suffocating. I glanced back one last time. The empty space was silent, but for some reason, I couldn't shake the image of April's face, her innocent mimicry of someone who was struggling to breathe, hanging there, her braid wrapped tightly around her neck. I didn't go back down until much later that evening, and when I did, the house felt unnervingly quiet. Story 5. The Woman in the Red Dress. My niece Lily had always been a cheerful and sweet child, but recently, she started telling me strange stories about a woman who would visit her room at night. The woman was always dressed in a bright red dress, and Lily said her name was Franny. According to Lily, Franny would sing a soft, soothing song as she stood by the bedside, and then, after a while, she would just vanish into thin air, leaving only the faintest trace of her presence behind. One evening, as I was sitting in the living room, I heard Lily calling me from upstairs. "Auntie, Franny is here again," she said, her voice a mix of excitement and unease. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off as just her imagination. I stood up and walked towards the stairs, feeling a strange unease creeping up on me. When I entered Lily's room, she was sitting on her bed, her eyes wide open, staring towards the door. The room was dark, save for the faint light filtering through the hallway. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. "Lily, sweetie, who's here?" I asked gently. Lily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pointed to the corner of the room, where there was nothing but shadows. "Franny, she's standing there," Lily whispered. I turned to the corner, heart pounding. My eyes searched the darkness, but all I could see was an empty space. "There's no one here, Lily," I said, trying to sound calm, but my voice betrayed me. Lily nodded solemnly, but her gaze remained fixed on the corner. "She's gone now, but she sings so beautifully, Auntie." She told me to never be scared. She always sings, and then she flies away. I turned back to Lily and took her hand, my mind racing. As I tried to reassure her, the air in the room felt colder. A sudden chill swept through the room, and I couldn't help but wonder, was there more to Lily's story than she was letting on? Story 6. Here's the story based on your prompt. The Blind Conductor. A few years ago, my friend and I were looking after her 4-year-old niece, Emma. My friend had always been a strong believer in the idea of reincarnation, and one evening, she decided to test Emma's thoughts on the subject. She asked a series of questions about the past lives, curious to see what the little girl might say. Most of the questions were met with innocent confusion, as you'd expect from a child that young. After a while, my friend decided to ask the big one, the question that would really test Emma's response. Before you were Emma, who were you? Emma, sitting quietly on the couch, looked up with a thoughtful expression. After a long pause, she answered in a soft, matter-of-fact voice, I was a conductor. I waved my hands like this. With that, Emma lifted her hands in front of her, as if she were holding a baton, and began moving her arms in sweeping, elegant motions. Just like a symphony conductor leading an orchestra. I froze. It wasn't the answer I expected, but it was the next part of her statement that sent a shiver down my spine. Emma had been born blind. She couldn't see the movements of a conductor, let alone replicate them so accurately. My friend and I exchanged looks, both unsettled by the strange coincidence. Emma was so sure of herself, so confident in her answer. She continued to mimic the motions, as if there were an invisible orchestra right in front of her, following her every gesture. We didn't know what to say, so we quietly let her finish, but both of us couldn't shake the feeling that there was something far more mysterious going on.